I don't know about you all, but these last several weeks have been really hard, especially if you are a close follower of the news like I am. The images that have been coming in from Minnesota of ICE agents just brutalizing everybody, masked federal agents just terrorizing everybody. It's been a lot.
We're talking bystanders, legal observers, passerbys, immigrants, citizens, just everybody in their wake.
So, Christine, who are we canceling today?
We are canceling ICE.
Are we canceling ICE or are we abolishing ICE?
We can do both.
We are Cancel Me Daddy. We can cancel them. Hey everyone, I'm Katelyn Burns.
And I'm Christine Grimaldi.
And you're listening to Cancel Me Daddy,
the show where we take a closer look at all the panic around cancel culture.
With thoughtful analysis.
And verbal shitposting.
I don't know what to say. I'm overwhelmed.
Yeah, I mean, we're witnessing one of the most violent, coordinated attacks on free speech in recent history.
Yes, and I will say we are recording this on January 16th, and it won't be out for another couple of weeks. So if we miss any of the news that happens in between now and then, we apologize for that. But the last couple of weeks have been terrible. Like I'm having trouble sleeping. Actually, I wrote a piece earlier this week about the murder of Renee Good in Minneapolis and how her queerness has been erased, and that took so much out of me. I did get a great response to it from a lot of different people.
It was a great piece.
In fact, I heard from our former guest, Kat Abugazale, who told me that was really good. And so that has helped a little bit, but like, man, I don't even want to think about the dues, but it's my job.
Yeah, I mean, it feels important to witness it, and also witnessing it is just, it's making my dreams turn violent.
Yeah. And, we are not explicitly a politics podcast, although obviously we bring it up a lot. We are more online discourses, media analysis, things like that. But we can't just go without talking about this stuff. And there are very real threats to free speech presented by what ICE and the federal government are doing right now. And I can't help but sit there and find a little bit of joy watching ICE agents fall on their ass on the ice.
Yeah.
ICE beats ICE, apparently.
Yeah, in the intro, I called it, a violent, coordinated attack on free speech. But it's not just free speech. There are real humans behind that speech.
It's existing.
Yeah. And so we went out and we got a special guest to join us today.
New York Times opinion columnist Jamelle Bouie.
New York Times, Katelyn.
I know. We're like coordinating with the dark side here.
But Jamelle gets, he's an exception to the rule.
I can't stand the phrase one of the good ones, but I will say, ordinarily, we don't promote the New York Times. But I've been a huge fan of Jamelle for a long time, and he has his own criticisms of the New York Times, some of which you'll hear in our interview. And I think he provides the kind of smart analysis that we go for on this show. So we are bringing him in. And listen, I know everybody has an opinion about the New York Times, none more so than I do, but
let's get into it.
Jamelle, welcome to Cancel Me Daddy.
Thank you so much for having me.
I've been a fan of your work for a long time, although I maintain sharp criticisms with your employer, but we're not getting into that today.
I maintain sharp criticisms with my employer too, so.
The whole country has been watching what's happening across the country, but especially in Minnesota with like these ICE actions and the protests and then the crackdown on the protests. And it's a pattern that has happened over and over and over again in my adult lifetime, but I think also within the country's lifetime, right? Mm-hmm. So we wanted to have you on to help us understand the larger context that's happening here with how police in general has historically been used to suppress the free speech of U.S. citizens.
Can you walk us through the historical precedents for this type of suppression of free speech by police?
Sure, I can do that. I mean, the historical precedents for the suppression of free speech by state authorities goes back to the beginning of the country. Notable examples include the suppression of the circulation of anti-slavery and abolitionist materials, in the 1830s and 40s, the pro-slavery gag rule on the floor of the House. One of the Constitution requires the House hear petitions. You have a right to petition your government, and the Congress is supposed to hear them. And there is a clampdown on anti-slavery petitions on the House floor for basically 2 decades. After the war, of course, there is state authorities suppressing the free speech rights and other civil rights of Black Americans. In the 1870s, when you're beginning to get the first real rumblings of serious labor unrest in the country, you are having suppressing of people's rights to assemble by state authorities. What this is, right, sort of more police violence doesn't really emerge, I'd say, like in a recognizable form until the emergence of like modern policing in the late 19th century, when you are having the kinds of urban unrest you might call race riots in major cities. You're seeing something that looks a little bit like this. I think you could probably analogize some of this to the informal but state-sanctioned violence against Black people in the South during Jim Crow, a little after Reconstruction and such throughout the 20th century. But I'd say that for our purposes, like all of this that we're seeing in Minnesota and in other parts of the country as well, wherever ICE is posted up, first obviously looks like some of the police repression we saw during the 2020 protest, where police officers across the country were engaged in really aggressive use of force. It looks like, back in 2014, maybe the signature moment of the first phase of Black Lives Matter, which were the Ferguson protests. It looks a lot like that. The heavily militarized police presence, the indiscriminate use of, so-called non-lethal munitions like rubber bullets and flash grenades. I bring up that militarization to say that it also looks like American occupation forces in Afghanistan, American occupation forces in Iraq. If you go back a century, there was a kind of conversation, to really too nice a way to put it, between American occupation forces in the Philippines and policing in the United States. Like techniques move back and forth. And in the same way, techniques of occupation, of population control have moved back and forth, including literal materiel, right? Literal, weapons and munitions and such have moved back and forth between the American military presence in Iraq and Afghanistan, and domestic law enforcement. And so looking at ICE and Customs and Border Protection, you're looking at two agencies that first, right, they're modern. Well, ICE is a modern agency formed in 2002 in the Department of Homeland Security Act. I believe CBP is as well.
Yeah, I like to say they're barely old enough to drink.
Right. And they are products of the war on terror. So in kind of in a very real sense, right? They're fruit of the same poison tree.
I mean, we know the origin. You just mentioned the origin of ICE, but previous to that, wasn't it like called the INS, where they were responsible for the type of enforcement that they purport to be doing now, which obviously it's changed.
Yes, Immigration and Naturalization Services, which most often worked with local law enforcement and the FBI to do a lot of its enforcement work. So two useful pictures of the pre-ICE, pre-CBP times, INS, is the opening of Barry Sonnenfeld's 1995 picture of Men in Black in 96 is an immigration raid. It sets the tone for the film. I
remember that.
And it's ostensibly INS who's involved. It's INS working with local police or local sheriff's department. And I think that's actually a pretty accurate view of vision of what that looked like.
Yeah.
And then also, if you look for any of the video or photos from the whole Elian Gonzalez saga.
Oh, yeah.
From 98, 99. Something that it's like only 90s kids will remember this.
I remember it vividly.
I remember
that picture of the child at gunpoint was everywhere.
Right. And that was INS as well.
Okay.
So that's to say that although, ICE and CBP, new agencies have their own toxic cultures and have from the beginning. And ICE is CBP. I think Border Patrol is an older agency and has always had this kind of toxic culture. ICE has always had this toxic culture, and INS had a toxic culture. Just the project of immigration enforcement, internal immigration enforcement, attracts, for lack of a better term, chuds. It attracts people who are inclined to black and white thinking,
Literally.
indiscriminate use of force.
Mhm.
Yeah, I mean, the type of person that would want to join one of those agencies in the first place is somebody who is probably ideologically committed to some sort of racial worldview, if you will. And I think you're seeing that now. Have you seen any reporting about pardoned January Sixers joining ICE? I know there have been like, how much of a crossover is there with these right wing gangs that have been operating since particularly Charlottesville? I mean, I know they're older than that, but like, how much of that? How much of those gangs getting involved with ICE?
Yeah, I'm not entirely certain. Real quick, just because I said it, CHUD is short for Cannibalistic Humanoid Underground Dweller. It is a 1984 film, and then there's a sequel, CHUD 2, about the CHUD. So that aside, just in case people didn't know. So I don't know how much crossover there is. I know that there is that purported drop of lots of names. I have not, like, I've seen that. I'm waiting for kind of like further confirmation that those people were actually in ICE. Slate ran a piece by a writer who went to a job fair for ICE, put her kind of application in the system, and then discovered later that she was on the rolls as like an ICE agent, which to me suggests like maybe some numbers fudging when it comes to hiring. There's a real sense, I mean, not real sense, there is reporting on the struggle both ICE and Customs and Border Protection have had hiring people. They've essentially dropped all qualifications for being hired. A couple months ago, I read a piece about how their physical qualifications they had to drop because they couldn't find people who could do them, which was very funny to me.
The sit-ups thing was so funny.
Yeah. People, they couldn't, it was like you had to be able to run a mile and a half in 14 minutes, which I will grant that might be a little difficult. But then you had to do 15 sit-ups and like 20 push-ups. And I was like, come on, guys, you can do that. So they had the lower physical requirements, lower educational requirements, all kinds of things to try to meet recruitment goals. And they still haven't been able to meet them. I suspect, right, that yes, to fulfill some of these recruitment goals, they have taken people who are functionally Proud Boys, or at least come from the same social strata as a Proud Boy, right? Like the same kind of like lumpen proletariat, thuggish person, generally alienated from their communities and themselves, sees in these agencies an attempt to do kind of like redemptive violence, and for, a hefty bonus of $50,000.
Yeah.
So I'm willing to bet that even if you don't have literal Proud Boys, basically the type is who is gravitating towards ICE. And that's apparent from the behavior of these people on the streets, right? Like no even pretense to discipline, no pretense to lawful behavior, kind of just, for lack of a better term, like wilding out at the mere confrontation of like any kind of resistance. The kind of stuff that if they were in an actual, like the administration said, we're fighting dangerous domestic terrorists. But if that were the case, if they were actually in a dangerous situation, then the lack of discipline, the lack of operational sense, all these things they would be sitting ducks. They'd be sitting ducks for anyone who wanted to like really mess with them.
This is what the Minneapolis police chief was talking about on the Daily the other day. I listened to it. And he almost made the police department in Minneapolis sound reasonable by ISIS standards. It was just the most wild thing.
Yeah, I mean, by the standards of ICE, most metropolitan police departments are perfectly professional and good at their jobs, which like should tell you the low standards of ICE.
Yeah, I mean, you see these images coming from Minneapolis of like these, groups of ICE agents trying to control crowds of protesters or observers or whatever. And you contrast it with like the NYPD in the Black Lives Matter protests. The NYPD looks like the best trained army in the world compared to these guys. But it kind of reminded me, did you see Andor by any chance?
I am halfway through season 2. I got paused and I have to return to it.
Okay. When you go to watch it, it reminds me of the Gorman Uprising episode. And I won't spoil it for you, but essentially an inexperienced group of stormtroopers gets sent to do crowd control, and it's in the hopes of provoking a larger reaction from the crowd. Do you feel like they are there to try to get that larger provocation to give the administration a casus belli or belli to go in with harsher actions?
I absolutely think that's what they want. I mean, I think that's specifically what Stephen Miller wants, right? Like Stephen Miller wants bloodshed. I mean, it feels weird to accuse, even, most loathsome American officials of not just being cavalier with the lives of Americans, but like actively wanting them dead for political purposes.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that's what's happening. I think that they both are using all the manpower they have. I think it's always worth remembering that there are, on paper, 22,000 people in ICE. About 6,000 of them are actual like agents in the field. And there's something like 2,500 of those agents in Minneapolis, right? So like basically almost half of the agency's active manpower is like in Minneapolis. They give you a sense of like both their strengths, such as they are, and their very real limitations and weaknesses. But I wouldn't be surprised if they're rotating in inexperienced people precisely because they want to provoke violence. The best thing I think that could happen for ICE, for Miller, for Nome, for all of them, is if an ICE agent got like shot and killed. They would love that. Which, no, I have no sympathy for ICE agents, right? But like, I wonder if they have the self-awareness to know that like the people above them view them as utterly expendable, right? Like don't give a shit about their lives. In addition to everything else, like that's like more immediate, it's impossible to overstate the role that the 2020 protest plays in like the mind space of conservatives. It drove them insane. And like that's not hyperbole. It's like it's the case, right? Like I can think of people in the business who's like actively lost their minds as a result of 2020 and as a result of the kind of like public outrage, uprising in response to George Floyd. And in the administration and the people around them, the MAGA right, there's a kind of firm belief that had Trump crushed those protests, like Tiananmen Square style, that he would have won re-election. We're saying the evidence is if the protest had never happened, Trump probably had a better chance of winning. And the protests like played a real and significant part in him losing because people don't like the appearance of chaos. And I think like, fucking massacring a bunch of people would have made life, he probably would have lost re-election. But that's what a lot of people around him wanted. And I think that how they're replaying 2020 in their minds all the time, right? I think that's part of the reason why Minneapolis was chosen, in addition to Walz being an opponent, in addition to Somali immigrant, that Minneapolis was the beginning of that drama with George Floyd. And so they want to provoke a response, and then they want to like use the Insurrection Act, which in their minds is like it's like a one-shot I win button, right? You hit it and then like, game over. And then they can do 2020, but right this time. I think that's what they want.
Yeah. I don't see the Insurrection Act going well in places like Boston or New York. Like they don't have the manpower for it. And there's historical precedents, especially in Boston, that as a masshole myself, I don't see that city standing for that.
I'm just thinking about when my parents turn on the news at night and hopefully not CBS News anymore.
You're not looking forward to Whiskey Friday with Tony Ducapill?
Sure not. I think I might need some whiskey to get through it.
I had forgotten that he was the guy in the Tanahashi Coates incident. And this happened literally on the episode that we released yesterday where we had Parker Malloy on and Christine and Parker were like, yeah, that's the guy. I'm like, that's the guy?
That's the guy.
And then I made the joke that Barry Weiss is collecting media racists like Infinity Stones.
Yeah.
When my parents put on the news, I'm glad that they are consuming, quote unquote mainstream media, but we also know how quote unquote mainstream media covers things like, racial justice protests like ICE. How is the media kind of echoing these disturbing narratives that we're getting from the Trump administration, and how are they hopefully breaking apart from them?
Yeah, there's something in law called a presumption of regularity when it comes to like executive branch decisions, right? You're supposed to assume that like things are happening basically on the up and up, and you shouldn't like assume bad faith. And I think that the media is operating with a presumption of regularity with regard to the Trump administration, which is interesting because I'm in the media. And I talk to people in other publications, other places, and other networks. And it's like in casual conversation, we all know that the world is actively falling apart. The administration is crazy. But I think that the professional norms are very strongly tilted towards this presumption of regularity. And so I think you saw this, right? So what was it, yesterday or 2 days ago? CBS reported that Jonathan Ross, the officer involved in the killing of Renee Nicole Good, had suffered internal bleeding as a result of the confrontation. That was the language clearly used to suggest that he had indeed been hit by a car. And then ABC News ran a similar headline. I believe the AP ran a similar headline. Like, it kind of just spread. In terms of just news judgment, it's like your headline should probably say that, like, this is disputed, right? Like, that this isn't, that all we have to go on for this is the word of the administration. And we know that they lie all the time about this kind of thing. But there was like a presumption of regularity. Well, you know, the administration releases information to us, and so we're gonna share it. It's like not even, it's like unthinking almost. And so to the extent that there's like this presumption of regularity with the press, I think it does result in kind of like the transmission of what are basically like lies and falsehoods from the administration, or at least things that like obscure and occlude the actual situation. There's also an unwillingness to use sort of pointed language, right? Sort of attacks on protesters are described as clashes, suggesting kind of like mutual agency in the confrontations rather than one side attacking the other. My view from the inside is that this has far more to do with like norms and systems and procedures than it does. Like, I don't think people are thinking. And there probably is a degree of like fear, but not like fear of the administration, fear of accusations of bias that go into this. And that to me explains a lot of the choices of language and such. I'll note, especially from political desks, politics desks tend to be, I think, much more institutionally conservative and cautious than subject matter expertise desks. And you kind of see that in all kinds of reporting.
I agree with you. You know, somebody who had both of those roles at the same time at Vox back in the day. Yeah, I could definitely see that. Obviously, Vox is a very different beast than a place like the Times. Oh, I wanted to ask about the 2020 Tom Cotton piece, Send in the Troops. That piece obviously prompted a lot of controversy. James Bennett was fired for some lapses in editorial on that piece. We covered it in our last episode, which was a retrospective on the Harper's letter, and that was one of the complaints of the Harper's free speech letter. And I was struck while we were doing that episode about how what Senator Cotton called for in that piece we're kind of seeing now, not just with ICE, but with the National Guard deployments to California last year, in Chicago and DC. So, yeah, Christine's town. So I wanted to get like your take on that development. What are your thoughts on it? Is this something that we should have seen coming once like Trump was reelected, or what?
Yeah. So with regards to the Tom Cotton op-ed, Tom Cotton, can I just say real quick, what a name for a Southern reactionary. Like, what a name for a Southern reaction. If I knew I was like, I'm 19-year-old Tom Cotton, and I know the type,
Yeah.
I went to school with the type, I know I want to be a politician. I'm like grooming myself to be in the Senate. I would change my name, because being a Southern reactionary named Tom Cotton from Arkansas sounds like you were like the final boss of slavery, like.
Jesus.
Like after
it wouldn't work in fiction, right?
Right, it wouldn't work, right? I mean, it really sounds like, after you pass the Emancipation Proclamation, then you have to fight Tom Cotton. He has to be blinking red before slavery can be over. So Tom Cotton, that op-ed. So when I read it,
yeah,
my immediate thought was, this is not an honest op-ed. Knowing what I know about Tom Cotton, knowing what I know about his rhetoric on social media, and reading the way that the op-ed's kind of like hedged and doesn't follow its own really like conclusions, I was like, what Tom Cotton wants very obviously is to send soldiers on the streets and use live ammo and like kill protesters. That is what he wants. It's very clear. And he doesn't say it outright. It's sort of like implied throughout. And so, when we, both in the public conversation about this, but also sort of like, in conversations amongst Times people, my critique was not necessarily that we shouldn't have published it, is that we should have published the honest version of it. If Tom Cotton thinks we should have gunned down protesters, that's newsworthy, and we should publish that. But that's what it should say. It shouldn't it shouldn't have had this kind of plausible deniability about it. And if that's what we want to publish, it shouldn't be the job of like some 25-year-old kid with no editor looking over him. It should have been Bennett, who, as you noted, was fired after all of this, admitted it, that he hadn't read the piece before it went up. And so, to my mind, I'm actually willing to buy the idea that it's newsworthy to have Tom Cotton say this, but the process of it and just the allowing him to essentially use the Times to put out something like very dishonest, that's what I thought was the issue. Because first of all, in practice, if we had been like, no, you have to say what you mean or we're not going to publish it, it would have never been published in the first place. It's only published because it gave him cover, right? And second of all, had it been published, again, noteworthy that one of the president's close allies wants the American military to gun down the Americans in the streets. I think that what we're seeing in Minnesota is like, that's what Tom Cotton wanted. They wanted goons in the streets attacking Americans. I mean, the thing is, and this gets back to the Insurrection Act, the desire to use the Insurrection Act. You invoke the Insurrection Act and you have members of you have regular army on the streets who, on the one hand, not necessarily trained for crowd control. On the other hand, have like very well-defined and strict rules of engagement, have a very strong culture of following those rules of engagement. So if you try to take an objective look at it, had you put soldiers in the streets, I'm not sure that there would have been any confrontations, right? Because like the soldiers don't want them. They would prefer not to have to do that.
Yeah.
And I think protesters are like wise enough to avoid those kind of confrontations. Confrontations with cops happen because cops often lack that kind of discipline.
Yeah.
And ICE in the streets doesn't have the discipline at all. And so I actually think the only way you could get something like Cotton was envisioning or Trump was envisioning is through this kind of use of a paramilitary force, which doesn't have the kind of professionalism or discipline that members of the regular army or even the National Guard have, right? Like the thing about the National Guard deployment to DC was that it was kind of like, it was weird, walking through Chinatown Metro and there's just like a bunch of dudes hanging out.
On the way to a toddler's birthday party on Capitol Hill.
Yeah. I was teaching in Georgetown last semester at Georgetown and like riding my bike to Georgetown and just like, a couple dudes hanging out on the corner. And it's like, oh yeah, there's the National Guard here. So it's strange. But first of all, they don't want to be there either.
Yeah.
And second of all, they kind of they have enough training and discipline to just be like, if someone is giving us a stink eye, we're not gonna grab our guns and wave them at them.
If anybody is curious about like military rules of engagement, there's actually a really decent movie for its time called Rules of Engagement.
Yes,
with Samuel
Jackson.
Yep. So if anybody has questions about how the military treats those rules, I think that's a pretty good movie for getting a feel for it. And it's also a pretty good like courtroom drama. Not the best, but not bad. It's a good time.
No, it's not one of it's William Friedkin, not one of his best. Yeah, not one of his best late Friedkins, but like it's Friedkin and he knows how to make a movie.
Yeah.
You posted a couple of interesting Blue Sky threads the other day about, does Trump have these kind of demigod powers when he says that I'm going to deploy X, Y, and Z? And what powers does he actually have to suppress free speech, despite the fact that he's doing it already? And, to cancel free and fair elections. I think you talked about that as well.
The way I see this, the way I think about this, both from just like observation of both Trump's first term and this term so far, and then just sort of like general knowledge about presidential power. So listeners, viewers may know of a 1952 Supreme Court case, Youngstown Sheet and Tube Company versus Sawyer, which involved President Truman trying to seize a steel mill for the war effort, Korean War, stabilize prices, that kind of thing. And he was sued, right? And the Supreme Court ruled that no, the president cannot claim, war powers, cannot claim, national defense, and then seize private property. And the most important part of this opinion is a concurrence by Justice Robert Jackson, where he kind of lays out a framework for thinking about presidential authority towards Congress, really thinking about presidential authority in general. And he divides it into three categories in descending order of legitimacy. The first category, when the president acts with the express or implied authorization of Congress, his authority is at its maximum. That's like, that's That's when the president is at his most powerful. Congress has passed a bill, says you can do this, have to carry this out, or we're delegating this power to you, and we're delegating it to you in these ways. The president is like in the clear. The second area is when there isn't a congressional grant of authority, but there's neither a congressional denial of authority. It's the president kind of relying upon his own independent powers. But because those independent powers are not necessarily well defined, right? Like it's not, the Constitution lays out what the president can do, but there's these notions of inherent executive powers. It's a little fuzzy. So Jackson says there is a zone of twilight in which he and Congress may have concurrent authority or in which its distribution is uncertain. So they may share authority here. Maybe Congress has more or the president has more. It's not really clear. And it can only really be adjudicated by Congress, by what Congress decides, oh yeah, the president can do that. We're gonna step back. Maybe it doesn't, so on and so forth. The president's power is at its lowest ebb. That's a quote from the opinion, when he takes measures that are incompatible with either the expressed or implied will of Congress. And in that case, the president's power is zilch. It's nil. He doesn't really have any, and he has no inherent authority to act here either. And then the president can kind of only sustain his actions if the court says, well, we don't think Congress has a role here. So a good example of that, and here's where I'm going with this, is Trump's attempt to remove agency officers that have for cause removal provisions. Congress creates an agency, says that it's independent, and that although the president can appoint these board members, for example, they can only be removed for cause. They cannot be removed at the president's pleasure. And right now, the Supreme Court's saying you can't do that. That's a violation of separation of powers to prevent the president from removing at his will. And so the president trying to remove someone ordinarily would be in that third category. But because the court has said, actually, Congress can't do that, now it's kind of back into that second category where now the president has power to act. Okay, Trump. When you look at where he has been the most authoritarian, like the most dangerous, it is in those places where he is either acting pursuant to an express or implied authorization of Congress, or in a place where Congress can decide the distribution of the authority. So immigration enforcement is a place where the president has a ton of discretion, and he's using it and weaponizing it in authoritarian ways. But he's able to do that because he's able to do that for the same reason Obama was able to do DACA, right? Two sides of the same coin. Because there's a lot of discretion given to the executive by both Congress and the courts for immigration enforcement. When the president issues executive orders trying to eliminate the federal recognition of trans people, right, via HHS, he is operating in a sphere where there actually is a lot of executive authority, right? There's a lot of executive authority to shape the mandate of HHS, of those agencies. And so he's operating kind of pursuant with the express or implied authorization of Congress. When Congress declined to stop something like DOGE, allowing the president to take like an axe to the federal bureaucracy, he is acting kind of with the implied authorization of Congress. And so that's where all the most aggressive things have happened in that zone. But when he steps outside of that zone, and especially when he steps outside of that zone with regards to the states, then things get dicier. Then it's like a little more difficult. Then it might be a lot more difficult because he doesn't necessarily have freedom of action. I think that's the phrase I use in Blue Sky, freedom of action. It's not so much a case of who's going to stop him, but it's a case of, well, who's going to stop these other actors from just doing what they're going to do anyway? And the president doesn't necessarily have the authority to stop those other actors. That's like how I think of things. And I think my case for thinking of things like this is, first, it's a helpful reminder that Trump is ultimately just a guy operating within a set of institutions. And it's not so much that the institutions are necessarily going to restrain him or anything, but that there are rules and processes and operations and logistics and all these things that do shape how A becomes B. So earlier we discussed how ICE is having trouble getting people, right? That's like an operational constraint. Congress can pass a bunch of goddamn money to give to ICE, and the president can be like, we need to build up a big deportation force. But if you actually cannot find the people, then that is a limit on your ability to do the things you want to do. Thinking about what the executive branch is, right? It's the president telling 10 people who then tell 100 people who then tell 10,000 people to do something. And depending on the strength of each of those links, things can happen or things may not. So for me, it's like, where is it where the lines of authority are clean and clear and there's a well-worn path for doing the thing? And that's where Trump is exercising his most aggressive power and authority. But when those lines are not clear, when he has to basically like bootstrap a new process, then things aren't as successful. The National Guard deployments are a good example of this.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So
sorry, that was like a bit of a monologue. But
no, it was great.
It was very interesting.
Yeah. I saw you kind of going back and forth with, I think, some people who probably are either current or former followers of mine about the potential for ICE deployments in like important swing state cities. I agreed with what you said, but I kind of wanted you to expand a little bit on that, or like explain, should people be concerned about something like that, or other types of law enforcement being deployed to intimidate potential blue voters? If it did come to pass, like, what should people do if they're confronted with those situations?
So I should say my view here is that I have no doubt that the president is going to try to use ICE to intimidate people. He's going to try to identify what he thinks are, the districts where there is going to be like illegal voting or something or whatever. And he's going to try to use his little private army to intimidate people. I think the thing people should always keep in mind is that the administration, neither its agents nor the administration itself is all that smart. Their two persistent political weaknesses are that they seem to not understand that other people have agency. And so they can take an action, but that there will be a reaction. They have to be able to anticipate that reaction, one. And two, the only move they have in their toolkit is escalation. So if it doesn't work, you apply more force. If that doesn't work, you apply more force. And the two things work in tandem. You're seeing that right now in Minneapolis and Minnesota broadly. You apply more force, people react, and they're like, I don't like that. And then they act in ways to demonstrate that. And because you have both no way of backing down and saving face and no real alternative, you apply more force, which just sort of hardens the resolve of the people they're against. So I say that because they can deploy ICE, right? They'll choose whatever districts, and they'll have to choose because all House seats are up, right? 435. There's not enough guys to send, and there's not enough guys in ICE or CBP to send a guy to every polling place. There are literally thousands, tens of thousands of polling places. So that's not legit. That's not feasible. So they'll have to pick and choose. But even then, first of all, not clear they'll pick and choose right. A. B. There's a 2-seat or 3-seat margin in Congress. So depending on the size of the wave, you're looking at anywhere from like 20 to as many as 40 or 50 seats flipping. So there's, in a real sense, it kind of doesn't matter how many places you choose because it's probably not going to really work out. You can't really stop it. Like most Trump efforts, it's likely to be half-hearted and half-assed and not particularly effective. But that doesn't mean it won't be scary or frightening or whatever. And my advice, as I think about this, is first to say that there's always strength in numbers. So bring some friends to go vote. I would bet, given how communities have responded to ICE, if this happens, there will already be community preparation. There will already be observers there. There will already be people, maybe even local law enforcement who is not too fond of ICE in a lot of places, that will be there to act as, the watchers who watch the watchers, right?
Yeah.
So I think that the way to prepare for this is the way that you would prepare for any election. It's to know your rights. It's to have a plan to vote. It's to bring people with you. And it's to hold your head up high and walk right in. Because ultimately you have a right to vote.
Yeah.
And they can't stop you.
And he can't actually cancel the midterm elections.
No, I mean, I was arguing about that. I was being polite on Blue Sky, but I think that's silly.
You don't have to be polite here.
Yeah.
I genuinely think that's silly. And I just actually made like a YouTube, I need to edit it, but I made a YouTube video about this. And the analogy I used is it's illegal to use your cell phone when you drive, right? It's illegal. You shouldn't do it. You might get pulled over if you do. But in like a literal physical sense, I can use my cell phone when I drive, right? I can pick up my cell phone and scroll while I drive. shouldn't do it. Everyone listening, you shouldn't do it. It's a bad idea. But like in a physical sense, there's nothing stopping you, right? The only thing stopping you is your own self-control and perhaps the guardrail, quote unquote, of the law. Now, it is also illegal to drive with my back facing the front and my front facing the back. You can't do that. But also, I physically can't do it, right?
Yeah.
It is physically impossible to do, at least for me. If someone can do it, congratulations, I suppose. But it's physically impossible to do.
If you can do this.
Yeah, record that. Show that to us. It's physically impossible. So Trump canceling elections is in category 2. It's not in category 1, a thing that he can do but shouldn't. I think for which there is like ability and power to do, but presidents shouldn't just kidnap the heads of state of other countries, but they can.
They can.
I mean,
and they have
if they're just going to ignore the law, they can totally do it. They shouldn't, but they can do it. But presidents actually do not have the literal, mechanical ability to cancel an election. They just, and I know that sounds to people like I'm saying a dog can't play basketball, then a dog plays basketball. But I don't know how else to phrase it other than to go through like a long explanation, because like there's no institutional mechanism for the president. Like I live in Virginia. Mm-hmm. If the president calls the head of the state board of elections and says you have to cancel the elections, then the head of the state board of elections can be like, okay, and hang up the phone and go about their day. Right? Like there's nothing, because the president's not his boss.
Yeah.
President's not responsible. I mean, it's just in that context, the president's just a guy, and whatever pressure you feel is purely social, right? It's purely informal. But if you don't feel that informal or social pressure, then like, all right, who cares? And that's where things are. So there's a lot of like technical reasons why this isn't possible, right? Like the things people suggest for interference, like, oh, they just won't seat them. Well, there's no one to not seat them, if that makes any sense. Mm-hmm. Like if you win a House election, what happens is your state board of election or your state office of Secretary of State gives you a certificate of certification, says you are the official winner. We recognize you as the winner. And then it sends a copy of that to the clerk of the chamber in question, the House or the Senate. And the clerk has that. And then when you go there, you're like, this is me. And they're like, yep, same certificate. And then you're there, right? So like you'd have to kill the clerk, right? Like when you start getting into the things you'd have to do, it's
I shot the clerk. I shot the clerk.
I shot the clerk.
Yes, when did you shoot him?
I shot the clerk.
Lots of movie references.
But I didn't shoot his deputy.
I love it.
My cousin Vinny, baby.
So like at that point, you're just doing a regular coup, right? Like,
yeah,
so
sure.
why would you go through the rigmarole? So that's my point. Like at the point, the things you would have to do for this to be feasible, you're better off just like doing a regular old coup.
I was thinking about we can borrow the vision of abortion clinic folks who like help escort the pregnant people from the parking lot into the clinic. Mm-hmm. Something like that type of model in a place where there is attempted that's what came to mind. I think Christine has one last question for you, and then we'll wrap it up.
Sorry to keep referring to your blue sky. It's been very interesting lately. You talked about, having this kind of accountability, perhaps when ICE is out of the cities, when Democrats maybe win majorities in the fall. And I guess my question is, since the January 6th Inquisition did not lead to the kind of sweeping changes that we wanted, what can Democrats do differently, and how might the media convey that differently to make sure that ICE, Trump, et cetera, are held accountable?
The January 6th committee did not successfully lead political actors in Republicans specifically, to do the kind of cleanup that needed to be done to really aggressively, in Merrick Garland, aggressively go after the political people responsible for this. Certainly all the lower level people got shit handed to them, but the political people didn't. Mm-hmm. The January 6th committee did successfully create the public record. Right. Mm-hmm. So I think this is actually very significant that Trump wants to have a vision that January 6th was like this grand celebration and it was no big deal. But the one effect of the January 6th Commission is that we have this massive public record of what happened. We have interviews, we have testimony, we have video, we have audio, we have this big record collected by Congress, certified by Congress, put into the congressional record, provided to the public of what happens. And there's nothing Trump can do about that. That is the public record. And even if there are millions of Americans who are like, January 6th was no big deal, those of us who are like, it was a big deal, we can point to the assembled public record to say, this is what happened. Scholars will rely on that public record when they do their work on January 6th. Like, it is very important that that happened. And so I would say for the January 6th committee that like looking at simply the political consequences of it is important, but it's also worth looking at kind of like how it shaped the overall landscape of how we remember and how we think about that period. And there it was, I think, a huge success. So looking forward, if Democrats win the House and Senate, and on Blue Sky, the thing I was analogizing it to was sort of one of the largest set of hearings in Congress's history, which was the 1871 hearings on Klan violence, where Congress took testimony from like 600 Black Americans throughout the South about Klan and vigilante violence, and produced it in like several, like 7 or 8 massive volumes. You know, even in the midst of Jim Crow, after everything that followed, remains very much the definitive record of that period of vigilante violence, that modern scholars use that testimony as the basis for their investigations. So 150 years later, right, it's still significant that Congress did that. Even with all the political setbacks, it was still significant. And I think that that's something that has to be done with ICE. I think that there has to be, because the Jan 6 committee I think was extremely well done. And I think anything like this would have to be produced for television like the Jan 6 committee was. But in terms of sort of the breadth of materials and the breadth of testimony, I think the Klan hearings are the real model. You want basically as many victims as possible of ICE violence, of immigration enforcement violence, to be able to say what happened to them, who did it, what the circumstances were, to tell us about it. They have their chance basically to be able to say, this happened to me and I matter, right? Like part of the power of the 1871 hearings is that many of these people were recently freed, right? And so this was an opportunity to say, this happened to me and it mattered. To have like an undocumented person be able to go before Congress and say, this happened to me and it mattered, in addition to, I think, playing a part in political accountability, is also just like the right thing to do. Like it's the right thing to do. But I think it's sort of a massive effort of just trying to document for immediate accountability and posterity what happened is important. In the response to that thread, someone was like, we have all the cell phone video. Why do we need to do hearings? You're stuck in the past. This is why people shouldn't listen to Jamelle Bouie. And I didn't respond to that because it would have been insane for me to respond to that. Yeah. But I did think about it because for as much as it was like bad faith, I also like, oh, well, it's not the worst objection in the world. And the reason is that even cell phone video is a bit indeterminate. We see that all the time. That like a single video may look clear to all of us in this conversation, but there are plenty of people who will have the opposite view. Yeah. And the thing about official proceedings and official testimony and collecting testimony and experiences and video materials from as many people as you can is it creates a impenetrable record. Like you can't dispute what happened, right? We have too much. You kind of reduce the indeterminacy to zero. And I think that's important too. Yeah. So that when you're making the political argument that we need to just get rid of this agency altogether, it can't exist. Yeah. And someone tries to contest what's happened, you can say, we have it on record. Yeah. And we have this testimony. Last thing I'll say here is that the most realistic time horizon for any kind of actual legislation or even executive action to dismantle ICE and CBP is January 2029. So you got to find a way to keep this at the top of the political agenda, and a bunch of dramatic and divisive hearings that like you're not worried about bipartisanship, you're just worried about kind of like accomplishing your political goal, I think is a very useful tool to have in the toolbox.
I was also thinking too, when you brought up the cell phone video thing, we just had this again. I'm referencing our last episode, which if people haven't listened to it, they should, where we were trying to go back and find the reaction to the 2020 Harper's letter because everybody was on Twitter at the time. Well, all the like liberal side of Twitter has left now for Blue Sky, and most people have deleted their accounts, and we literally could not find more than half of the posts that we wanted to reference. And I think that also lends to that there's an impermanence to these like social media, cell phone records, cell phone video records that we have here. And to your point, bringing it into the official congressional record would really solidify that for people studying this stuff in the future and for future political actors when they're making decisions about the future of ICE. But having said that, Jamelle, it's been great having you on. Truly an honor for me. I've long admired your work. Where can our listeners find you and your stuff?
We've already mentioned Blue Sky, so you can find me on Blue Sky at your peril. I work for the New York Times. If you care to, you can read me at the New York Times. If you don't, that's okay too. No hard feelings from me. If you want to get like a version of that stuff, I have maintained a pretty active presence on TikTok. And my TikTok account is just like at Jamelle Bouie. I'm on Instagram as well, and I usually cross post there, and that's just at jbouie. And I also have a YouTube page that I am trying to really use more often, and that is at Jamelle-Bouie. Me and my buddy John Gans, who has a great book, When the Clock Broke, about the 1992 in American politics. We have a movie podcast called Unclear and Present Danger about the political and military thrillers of the 1990s. So like Rules of Engagement is like a movie we're going to cover.
Oh my God, I should listen. I should listen to this.
So cool.
This is my jam.
And so you can subscribe to that as well.
Yeah.
So that's generally where you can find me. I do consider myself like a writer first and foremost. And so if you want to read my writing, kind of like your only option is the Times. But I always try to post GIF links on Blue Sky for stuff. So if you just want to read me, there's a pretty good chance you can do that without having to give any money to the New York Times.
All right. Thanks, Jamelle.
Thanks so much.
Thank you, guys.
All right, Christine, the heavy stuff is over. Are you ready to have a little fun?
Oh, I sure am, Kate.
It is time for Out of Context Cancellations. So you can submit your own Out of Context cancellation either on our Discord, which is available to anybody who joins our Patreon, or in the YouTube comics section, or you can now leave a voice memo for us to play on air. We don't have any of those this week, but you can find that at memo.fm/cancelmedaddy. So, starting in the Discord, we're canceling AI summaries.
Oh my God, I was just complaining about that to you earlier today. Yeah, because I can't get it to shut off on my Gmail. So now it wants to AI summarize every single one of my emails.
Who thinks this is a good idea? Is it CEOs that don't read their emails?
I guess so. But you still have to read the 2 incorrect sentences that they pull up.
Yeah. Next, we're canceling not being able to distinguish Parker's voice from Christine's in the latest episode.
I just wanted to go like this.
I don't get that one. Maybe it's because I know both of you personally. But yeah, I could see how that would be a little confusing. We're canceling the important businesses going out of business.
Ooh, I don't know what that could be about, but I kind of like that I don't know what that could be about because it's out of context.
Yeah. I mean, I'm still sore over Circuit City going out of business. So,
oh man, Circuit City. That's, I think, where I got my very first recorder.
Yeah.
When I became a journalist.
I mean, you're like a New York City metro person at heart. Do you remember Nobody Beats the Wiz?
Yes. There's also Seinfeld doesn't hold up in so many ways, but there is a very funny Seinfeld episode about it.
Yes, there is.
Yes. Uncle Jerry, please change your politics.
Also his dating. Preferences.
Yeah. 17.
We are canceling the present regime.
Oh, yes, please.
I think we kind of did that in this episode.
I was about to say, we can both cancel and abolish.
Canceling owners letting their dogs off leash in a leash mandated area.
Yeah, you don't know what any sort of animal is going to do, so you need to take precautions.
We're also canceling muddy dog parks.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
And then somebody else in the Discord said, no, my corgis disagree and they love them. So maybe a half cancel on that one.
Half a cancel, sure.
Cancel panic attacks.
100%.
That was my weekend last week.
Ooh.
It was really
from
bad.
all the news, or
it was the news, and I went a couple of days without my anti-anxiety medication.
Yeah,
and that wasn't a good combination. So
yeah, we had a long talk in therapy this week about how just feeling this kind of existential dread could just be coming from the news out there.
I mean, I've been dealing with it by like binging the Heated Rivalry soundtrack.
Ooh.
I'll link to a playlist in the description.
Oh, thank you so much. I'm going to do that next.
We actually have quite a few cancellations today.
Yeah.
We are canceling the great state of Ohio.
Oh, okay. Cancel Ohio.
I'm down with that.
Sorry if you're from Ohio.
Have I ever told you my favorite Ohio joke?
No, what's that?
There have been 21 astronauts who came from the state of Ohio. What is it about that state that makes people want to flee the planet?
Oh, wow. That's like all the money that's been spent trying to save Matt Damon. Sorry, The Martian's been on. I've been watching that like over and over.
I just wrote on my newsletter about his bit on Jimmy Fallon the other night, where him and Ben Affleck and Jimmy Fallon were doing pronunciations, Massachusetts town names.
Yeah, and they're from Massachusetts, but they still can't pronounce
They still
names.
fucked a bunch of them up.
Well, they're from
Quincy.
Boston.
What the fuck? It's not Quincy. It's Quincy.
Quincy.
Also, John Quincy Adams. It's the way you say it.
I did not know that.
Yeah.
See how much I learned on this podcast?
Exactly. Next, we're canceling the Bad Faith Brigade of anti-woke Star Trek fans.
Oh, yeah. I thought Star Trek was supposed to be a happy place.
I'm not a Trekkie at all, but I follow a few people who are, and there's a new show, I guess, apparently, that some of the hardcore fans aren't appreciating. I shouldn't say hardcore. I should say misogynist.
Yeah.
Yeah. We're also canceling William Shatner.
Oh, well, yeah. He's number one on that shit list.
I think maybe the funniest block I ever caught on Twitter was from Shatner.
Did you really get blocked by William Shatner?
And I deserved it.
Nice.
I dunked on him harder than Shaquille O'Neal shattering the backboard.
He deserved it.
And then this is a funny one to end off the Discord cancellations. Somebody wants to cancel us too.
Okay. I will self-cancel.
Because of our jailbait bit in the Olivia Newsy episode.
Oh, yeah. I would cancel us for that too.
And this person says, my husband asked who Newsy was, and I sent him your app and on her, and he threw his headphones.
Wow, to inspire such a reaction. But remember, we're Catholic, so nobody can cancel us harder than we cancel ourselves.
It's true. And then lastly, we are highlighting from the YouTube comments on our last episode. And this is really great because we're recording this literally the day after that one released, but somebody wants us to cancel the high RAM prices.
Oh, yeah. Cancel.
And this is not RAM the animal or RAM the truck. It's RAM the computer memory. And those prices are just wickedly out of control from all the AI bullshit. So that's been Out of Context Cancellations. We're going to take it over to the Patreon now. If you want to get access to that, you can join us at patreon.com/cancelmeatdaddy or by becoming an Apple supporting member of the podcast. See you all in 2 weeks. But anyway, we have Ombudsman Corner to talk about.
We can't talk about heated rivalry the entire time.
Oh, God. Can you imagine if we lived in a world where we could?
Yes.
That'd be so nice.
The heated rivalry corner.
I will say it's been surprising to me that there has not been a huge conservative shit show backlash over heated rivalry.
Maybe it's because it's a Canadian production. Thank our Canadian friends.
Yeah, but even the Canadian right wing is not saying anything about it.
Maybe because they're all watching it. Just saying.
Insert joke about Grindr at CPAC here.
Hey.
Reminds me of the time I almost stepped on Ben Shapiro at CPAC.
Is he tiny?
He's tiny, yeah. He's shorter than Greg Bovino.
Oh,